Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Imagine standing on the edge of a quiet lake at dusk, the kind where you might cast a line on lazy Sundays back home in the heartland, only to watch your daughter-in-law hurl a suitcase into the murky water as if it carried the weight of all her unspoken burdens, followed by a splash that echoes into silence until a faint, heartbreaking whimper slices through the air like a plea you can't ignore, drawing you deeper into a mystery that unravels the fragile threads of family loyalty and hidden betrayals you never saw coming, because this isn't merely about a discarded bag, but about the lies we weave to hold our loved ones close while pushing them toward the brink, and the small revenges we savor in the shadows that might just illuminate the path to truth or lead us all astray. That moment would come later, but it all started building months before. Last summer during a 4th of July barbecue in our backyard in this unassuming Ohio town where neighbors wave from porches and secrets simmer just beneath the surface of polite conversations, the air thick with the scent of sizzling burgers on the grill and the faint tang of fireworks lingering from the night before, as I, Maggie Harlan, a 62-year-old widow, still adjusting to the empty echo of my split-level house 5 years after my husband Earl's sudden heart attack stole him away during what should have been a routine checkup at the clinic where I worked as a nurse for decades, found myself surrounded by the familiar chaos of family and friends gathered to celebrate independence in a way that ironically highlighted how tethered we all remained to one another's flaws and unspoken grievances. My son Tom, 38 and built like the reliable Ford trucks he services daily at the local dealership with hands perpetually stained by grease and a smile that carries echoes of his father's easygoing charm, manned the grill with focused determination, flipping patties and corn on the cob while exchanging light-hearted banter with my sister Ruth and her husband Bill, who had driven over from the next county with their famous potato salad dressed in just enough mayonnaise to evoke memories of church potlucks, where everyone pretended their lives were as straightforward as the recipes shared in community cookbooks. And amid the laughter of neighborhood kids chasing fireflies with sparklers that painted fleeting trails of light across the deepening twilight, Lisa, Tom's wife of 7 years and a 35-year-old real estate agent whose polished demeanor and yoga-sculpted frame always seemed a touch too curated for our down-to-earth gatherings, moved through the crowd with effortless grace, her bobbed hair catching the fading sun as she discussed investment apps and market trends with the guests in a voice that carried the subtle lilt of someone who had traded small-town roots for bigger ambitions in the city an hour away, though I couldn't shake the nagging sense that her enthusiasm masked a restlessness bubbling just below, especially when her phone began buzzing insistently in her pocket like an unwelcome intruder at a family affair. As the evening wore on with plates piled high and stories flowing freely about everything from Tom's recent promotion prospects to Ruth's latest gardening triumphs that filled her yard with vibrant blooms defying the summer heat, I noticed Lisa excusing herself repeatedly to take those calls, slipping behind the old oak tree or into the shadow of the shed where her words drifted back in fragmented urgency. Not now, you can't keep pushing like this, prompting a twist in my gut honed from years of reading between the lines in hospital rooms where patients hid their pains behind forced smiles, and though Tom dismissed my sidelong glance with a reassuring pat on my shoulder, claiming it was just another demanding client closing deals on those sprawling suburban homes that symbolized the American dream we all chased in different ways, I caught the fleeting shadow of doubt in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. A mirror to my own growing unease that this polished addition to our family might be harboring cracks wide enough to swallow the stability we'd all worked so hard to build through lean times and quiet sacrifices like the ones Earl and I endured during the recession when his auto shop shuttered and we stretched every dollar with overtime shifts and home-cooked meals that stretched further than our worries. By the time the stars began pricking the sky and we bundled the leftovers into coolers amid hugs and promises to do it all again next year, Lisa enveloped me in a hug that lingered a beat too long, her expensive perfume overwhelming the smoky remnants of the grill as if she were layering on scents to conceal something far more intangible and troubling beneath the surface of her composed facade, leaving me to retire to the quiet of my kitchen where the day's events replayed in my mind like a looped Real, compelling me to tidy up the guest room they'd used for their overnight stay, and there, tucked innocently in the side pocket of her purse left behind in haste, I discovered a crumpled receipt for a motel room 2 towns over dated just the previous week. Its implications igniting a slow burn of indignation that this woman, whom I'd welcomed into our fold with open arms and homemade pies, might be betraying the man who deserved unwavering fidelity after the heartaches he'd weathered in his own search for lasting partnership. The discovery fueled a restless night where sleep evaded me like a skittish cat, my thoughts churning over whether to confront her directly and risk fracturing the delicate peace Tom clung to so desperately, or to bide my time and observe from the sidelines as the pieces fell into place. But when she texted the next morning about retrieving her forgotten silk scarf, the one she'd draped so casually over the chair like it was an afterthought, I seized the opportunity for a subtle retaliation that would remind her actions carried consequences without alerting the rest of the household to my suspicions. So as she entered my kitchen all smiles and feigned apologies for the oversight, I positioned myself near the counter where the remnants of last night's barbecue sauce sat in a jar, its thick, tangy contents a perfect vehicle for an accidental mishap that unfolded precisely as I nudged the edge with my elbow just as she reached forward, sending a generous splatter across the front of her pristine white blouse that she always boasted about snagging on sale, though it screamed high-end labels far beyond a modest agent's salary. "Oh dear, Lisa, these jars can be so slippery after a long day," I remarked with feigned innocence while passing her a wad of paper towels, inwardly relishing the irony of the stain marring her impeccable presentation as a fitting emblem for the hidden messes she seemed intent on concealing from my son. And though she masked her irritation behind a tight-lipped chuckle before hurrying out with vows to handle the dry cleaning herself, the small victory settled over me like a warm blanket on a chilly evening, a momentary balm against the uncertainty that had taken root in our family dynamics. Yet that fragile satisfaction dissolved into concern later that evening when Tom phoned to catch up on the day's trivia, his voice warm at first, but trailing off into hesitation as raised voices erupted in the background. Lisa's sharp tone slicing through with accusations of meddling old bats who can't mind their own business, followed by Tom's heavy sigh that carried the weight of a man caught between loyalties he never anticipated having to divide so sharply, leaving me staring at the receiver in the dim light of my living room and wondering just how deep this rift ran and what other shadows lurked in the corners of their marriage waiting to emerge and test the bonds we'd all assumed were unbreakable. Reflecting on how it all truly began takes me back 7 years to that crisp autumn county fair where the air hummed with the scent of caramel apples and hay bales stacked high against the midway lights, a place where Tom, still nursing the sting of a messy breakup from a girl who'd decided city life suited her better than a steady garage routine, wandered the booths with a half-hearted interest until he spotted Lisa manning a charity table for the local animal shelter, her laughter drawing him in like a moth to a porch bulb as she handed out flyers with that infectious energy that promised more than just a cause, and within weeks they were inseparable. Her tales of escaping a stifling small-town upbringing in Indiana to chase real estate dreams in the bustling outskirts of Columbus, captivating him in a way that made me both hopeful and wary from the start. Because while she brought a spark to his eyes that had dimmed after his father's passing, there was always that undercurrent of her guarded past she glossed over with jokes about boring family drama that hinted at fractures she wasn't ready to expose, leading to their whirlwind wedding at the same lakeside chapel where Earl and I had exchanged vows under a canopy of dogwoods blooming defiantly against the spring chill. A ceremony small and heartfelt, with me contributing the 3-tiered cake frosted in buttercream and adorned with fresh berries that symbolized the sweetness I prayed their union would yield, though even then I sensed Lisa's reluctance to fully root herself in our traditions, preferring instead to nudge Tom toward evening classes at the community college for certifications that might elevate him beyond the oil stains and wrench turns of his daily grind, all while transforming their modest apartment into a showcase of sleek furniture catalogs that clashed with the cozy clutter of our family heirlooms she'd politely sidelined into storage bins labeled with efficient precision. Fast forwarding Through those early years filled with holiday gatherings where she'd charm the relatives with stories of closed deals on starter homes for young couples mirroring their own aspirations and occasional tensions over her late nights at networking events, that Tom accepted with a shrug, attributing it to her ambition fueling their joint savings for a down payment on something more permanent. The barbecue incident and that damning motel receipt had ignited a fire in me that refused to be doused by mere reassurances, propelling me into a cautious investigation the following week when Tom extended an invitation for a casual dinner at their newly purchased ranch-style house on the town's fringes. A property with a white picket fence and a mortgage that struck me as overly ambitious given the economic whispers circulating about rising interest rates pinching even the most frugal households in our community. Where Lisa greeted me at the door with her usual poise, dressed in a simple sheath that accentuated her figure without ostentation, though the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes suggested the polish came at a cost as she ushered me inside to a table set with grilled chicken breasts marinated in herbs and a quinoa salad dotted with feta and cherry tomatoes that represented her healthier take on meals compared to my comfort food staples of mashed potatoes and pot roasts simmered for hours in the slow cooker. Conversation flowed initially around neutral ground like the changing leaves painting the neighborhood in fiery hues and Tom's optimism about a potential raise that could ease their budgeting woes. But midway through the main course, Lisa's phone vibrated once more on the sideboard, prompting her to rise abruptly and retreat to the adjoining office with the door clicked shut behind her, her muffled voice carrying snippets of urgency that echoed the secretive calls from the barbecue and stoked my resolve to uncover more while she was momentarily absent tending to what she called a quick freshen up in the bathroom, allowing me a brief window to ease open the top drawer of the desk where statements from a credit card bearing her maiden name lay stacked haphazardly, revealing balances that climbed perilously like unchecked weeds in a neglected garden, charges for upscale hotels in nearby cities, intimate dinners at restaurants Tom had never mentioned joining her for, and even a sparkling tennis bracelet purchase that far exceeded the discretionary spending we'd discussed during family budget talks over coffee the previous Christmas, each line item painting a portrait of extravagance that clashed violently with the frugal ethos Earl and I had instilled in Tom through years of belt-tightening during his shop's closure in the 2008 downturn when we juggled second jobs and coupon-clipped our way through grocery runs to keep the lights on and dreams alive. The discovery landed like a punch to the solar plexus, evoking memories of how we'd navigated our own financial tightropes without resorting to hidden debts that could erode trust faster than rust on an old Chevy frame, and as Lisa re-emerged with a composed smile inquiring about seconds on the salad, I wrestled with the dilemma gnawing at my conscience, whether to shatter Tom's illusions by revealing these fiscal indiscretions that suggested not just poor choices, but potentially a double life undermining the foundation of their marriage, or to hold the information close like a loaded gun, waiting for irrefutable proof that might justify the fallout, a choice complicated further when Tom casually mentioned over dessert their aspirations to start a family soon, his face alight with the kind of paternal hope that twisted the knife deeper into my protective instincts, making me envision the instability such secrets could inflict on an unborn child caught in the crossfire of adult deceptions. The internal conflict simmered through the rest of the evening as we cleared plates and shared a final cup of after-dinner tea, Lisa dropping veiled references to the pressures of her career and how investments in networking paid dividends in the long run, but her evasiveness only fueled my determination, leading me to bide my time until her next visit a couple of days later when she arrived at my doorstep under the pretense of seeking maternal advice on preconception wellness, tips gleaned from online forums and women's magazines stacked neatly on my coffee table. Her presence in my kitchen stirring a pot of barely contained frustration as we sipped iced tea sweetened with a touch of honey from the local apiary. And though she dominated the dialogue with questions about vitamins and stress management that skirted too close to her own evidence drains, I noted her reliance on that signature artisanal coffee she brewed meticulously from pods imported from some trendy roastery, a ritual she performed with almost ceremonial focus each morning to kickstart her high-octane days. Seizing upon this small vulnerability as an outlet for the pent-up ire without resorting to outright confrontation that might alert Tom prematurely. I waited until she turned to retrieve creamer from the refrigerator and swiftly exchanged her prized caffeinated pod with one from my own stash of decaf, reserved for those insomnia-plagued nights when worries about family kept sleep at bay. The switch so seamless it blended into the mundane rhythm of our chat, and as she savored the first sips with her usual appreciative nod, the effects manifested gradually in her increasing fidgetiness and disjointed recounting of a recent client negotiation that devolved into rambling tangents even I could poke holes in. Her energy plummeting like a balloon deflating midair while she excused the lapse with a wave of her hand claiming a long week catching up to her, prompting me to offer a sympathetic murmur about how even the strongest brews can't always deliver when the beans betray you, with a hidden layer of amusement at the poetic justice of her polished routine unraveling from such innocuous sabotage that left her jittery and off-kilter without a clue to the culprit. The petty triumph lingered as she departed earlier than planned, promising to follow up on the advice, but clearly rattled by the unexpected slump. Yet that fleeting sense of equilibrium shattered a few days hence when Tom enlisted me to house-sit during their spontaneous weekend getaway to visit distant relatives, a task that involved sorting through their accumulated mail piled on the entry console where, amid utility bills and junk flyers, an unmarked envelope addressed solely to Lisa, postmarked from Chicago, caught my eye with its plain white facade and lack of return sender details that screamed intentional anonymity, and though every fiber of propriety urged me to leave it untouched as an invasion too far into their privacy, the cumulative weight of receipts and whispers compelled me to carefully steam the seal over a kettle's rising vapor in the privacy of their kitchen, revealing a single sheet of lined paper inscribed with hurried script declaring, "We need to talk about the past before it catches up and ruins everything you've built." The words hanging like a storm cloud over the horizon of our family's fragile peace and igniting a cascade of questions about what buried history from Lisa's life threatened to unearth itself and drag us all into the undertow of consequences none of us were prepared to face. Those cryptic words from the Chicago letter haunted my thoughts like an unsolved puzzle from one of those late-night mystery shows Tom and I used to watch together after Earl's passing when the house felt too empty without his snoring from the recliner, propelling me through the ensuing days with a vigilance that bordered on obsession as I pondered the shadows of Lisa's past and how they might intertwine with the financial tangles I'd uncovered, all while maintaining a facade of normalcy during our sporadic phone check-ins where Tom shared updates on his workweek filled with oil changes and transmission rebuilds that grounded him in the tangible reliability of engines over the elusive mechanics of human hearts. Though I detected a subtle strain in his voice that mirrored my own internal turmoil over whether to burden him with the fragments of evidence stacking up like unpaid bills in a forgotten drawer, a dilemma that intensified when my sister Ruth proposed a family dinner at her cozy bungalow 2 weeks later. The kind of gathering centered around her legendary lasagna layered with ricotta cheese bubbling under a blanket of mozzarella and ground beef seasoned with garlic and oregano that always transported us back to childhood suppers where worries dissolved in the warmth of shared plates and stories exchanged over glasses of red wine from the discount bins at the local grocer, promising a neutral ground to air out the undercurrents without the isolation of private confrontations that could escalate into irreparable rifts. The evening arrived with a crisp autumn bite in the air that nipped at our cheeks as Tom and Lisa pulled up in their sensible sedan, her arm looped through his in a display of unity that felt almost performative given the secrets I suspected simmered beneath. And as we settled around Ruth's oak table adorned with a checkered cloth and flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls lined with family photos capturing happier times before ambitions and hidden debts complicated the picture, I couldn't ignore the glint of a new necklace encircling Lisa's neck. A delicate silver chain with a heart-shaped pendant that caught the light like a beacon of extravagance amid the credit card statements I'd glimpsed showing balances teetering on the edge of disaster, prompting casual chit-chat about the turning leaves in the neighborhood parks, where folks walked their dogs and dreamed of retirement cottages by the lake that symbolized the simple escapes we all craved from life's relentless pressures. Bill, Ever the peacemaker with his corny jokes about the upcoming football season and how the local team might finally clinch a playoff spot if the quarterback stopped fumbling like a novice. Kept the mood buoyant initially as we passed the steaming dish and twirled noodles onto our forks, delving into lighter topics like Ruth's daughter's impending arrival of a grandchild that sparked envy-tinged excitement in Tom about their own stalled plans for parenthood, but the equilibrium shattered when Lisa's phone illuminated once more on the table's edge with a notification she silenced hastily. Her fingers trembling slightly in a way that betrayed the composure she wore like armor forged in boardrooms where deals were struck over handshakes hiding ulterior motives. Seizing the moment after the main course had been savored and plates pushed aside for slices of apple pie drizzled with caramel sauce that evoked harvest festivals from our youth, I decided the time had come to lay my suspicions bare without the blunt force of outright accusation. Sliding the motel receipt across the tablecloth toward her with a steady gaze honed from years of delivering difficult diagnoses in the ER, where truth often cut deeper than scalpels, remarking evenly that I'd found it tucked away after the barbecue, and wondered aloud if such client meetings aligned with the family budget they'd shared during last Thanksgiving's budgeting session when Tom expressed pride in their joint savings goals mirroring the frugality Earl and I had modeled through economic storms that tested marriages more fiercely than any infidelity rumor. The room fell into a hush broken only by the clink of a fork against china as Lisa's face paled before flushing with a mix of indignation and panic, her eyes darting to Tom, who stared at the paper as if it were a foreign artifact from a life he didn't recognize, and in the ensuing chaos of voices overlapping like a poorly tuned radio, she accused me vehemently of rifling through her personal effects in a witch hunt driven by jealousy over her success in a field that elevated her beyond the blue-collar confines of our shared heritage, a twist that stung because it echoed the very doubts I'd harbored about my own relevance in their modern world while Ruth interjected with pleas for calm and Bill poured more wine to diffuse the tension that crackled like static before a storm. Tom's reaction cut deepest, his denial of any wrongdoing on Lisa's part laced with a defensive edge that strained the loyalty he'd always extended to me as his anchor through life's upheavals, forcing me into a moral quagmire where pushing further risked alienating him permanently in favor of a truth that might destroy the illusion of their happiness, yet retreating felt like complicity in whatever shadows the receipt illuminated. Perhaps an affair cloaked in business excuses or a deeper entanglement tied to that ominous letter from her past that now loomed larger in my imagination as the potential architect of her secretive behaviors. The confrontation spilled beyond the dining room into raised tones that echoed down the hallway, culminating in a standoff outside by the retention pond behind Ruth's property. A modest body of water stocked with bass for weekend anglers, but carrying an eerie calm under the sodium glow of street lamps that mirrored the lake from our wedding vows where secrets might dissolve into ripples if discarded carelessly, where Lisa clutched her purse tightly and what I later learned was a small travel suitcase packed for an upcoming work trip, her frustration boiling over into a hissed warning for me to stay out of their affairs lest I regret the meddling that painted me as the villain in her narrative of upward mobility clashing with familial oversight. As the argument peaked with Tom pulling her away toward their car amid apologies to Ruth and Bill for the disrupted evening, I retreated to my vehicle with the weight of unspoken accusations pressing down, but before driving off, I scrolled through the family group chat still active with Ruth's candid snapshots from the dinner, zeroing in on one capturing Lisa midlaugh with a smudge of sauce on her chin from an earlier bite that humanized her perfection in a way she loathed, forwarding it to the thread with a caption reading, "Honest moments like these keep our family grounded and real, don't they?" That elicited a flurry of replies and undoubtedly seared her with embarrassment upon seeing it later. A clever revenge wrapped in the guise of lighthearted sharing that satisfied my urge for payback without direct confrontation while underscoring the irony of her polished image cracking under scrutiny, much like the secrets she guarded so fiercely. Yet as I navigated the dark roads home, the image of that suitcase in her grip lingered ominously. teasing the edges of what desperate act it might precipitate and whether the pond's quiet depths foreshadowed a revelation that would either vindicate my instincts or drown us all in regret. The fallout from that disastrous dinner clung to the air like the stubborn fog that rolls off the retention pond on chilly mornings, turning every subsequent interaction between Tom and me into a minefield of unspoken accusations and half-hearted apologies that neither of us fully believed. As he texted sporadically over the next couple of days defending Lisa's need for space amid her demanding career, while I countered with gentle reminders of the red flags waving like caution signs on a rain-slicked highway, my protective instincts clashing against his growing frustration that painted me as the overbearing force disrupting their harmony. A dynamic that left me isolated in my own home, surrounded by the ghosts of family photos on the mantel where Earl's grin seemed to chide me for stirring pots better left simmering quietly. Though the real dilemma gnawed deeper as I wrestled with the impulse to share the Chicago letter's ominous contents that could either bridge the gap or widen it into an unfordable chasm, forcing me to question if my meddling stemmed from genuine concern or the loneliness that amplified every perceived slight like an echo in an empty garage after the last car pulls away. Desperation for clarity drove me to immerse myself in routine distractions, such as vigorous yard work under the fading autumn sun, clipping overgrown hedges with shears that bit into branches as sharply as my thoughts into Lisa's motives. The physical exertion a temporary salve against the emotional bruise of Tom's divided allegiance that echoed the relational tightropes I'd navigated in my nursing days when families fractured under the weight of hidden diagnoses. Yet, even as sweat beaded on my brow and leaves crunched underfoot, the vision of that small suitcase from the dinner confrontation persisted like a half-remembered dream teetering on the brink of nightmare. Its presence in Ruth's garage confirmed by her casual mention during a phone call about Lisa's hurried retrieval earlier that week under the guise of packing for a business trip that struck me as suspiciously timed given the escalating tensions. 2 days after the meal, Lisa appeared unannounced on my doorstep in the late afternoon light that slanted golden through the trees. Her eyes rimmed with what could have been exhaustion from sleepless nights or the subtle puffiness of suppressed tears masked by expertly applied concealer, demanding the return of an item she'd left behind during the chaos, though in truth it was the suitcase she'd fetched from Ruth that now fueled her urgency as she brushed past me into the living room with the entitlement of someone accustomed to closing deals on her terms. Her voice laced with a clipped edge that accused me of orchestrating a campaign to undermine her marriage through whispers and insinuations that turned Tom against the very partnership she'd built brick by careful brick from the ruins of her own ambiguous history. Our exchange devolved rapidly into another heated exchange, echoing off the walls papered in faded florals that had witnessed countless family milestones. Her claims that I viewed her as an interloper threatening the sacred Harlan legacy clashing with my retorts about transparency in a union where debts and secretive calls eroded trust faster than termites in a neglected foundation. The argument reaching a fever pitch when she snatched a framed photograph from the side table depicting Tom as a gap-toothed boy perched triumphantly on Earl's shoulders during a long-ago fishing trip to the lake that held so many of our cherished memories, stuffing it into her oversized bag as a symbolic retaliation that pierced my heart more acutely than any verbal barb, because it felt like she was pilfering fragments of my son's innocence to wield as leverage in our escalating feud. Tom rang midway through her tirade, his tone siding unmistakably with her narrative of my interference as an outdated intrusion into their adult lives. A betrayal that deepened the rift and plunged me into a vortex of self-doubt where choices loomed like storm clouds: swallow the pride and extend an olive branch that might paper over the cracks, or persist in my quest for answers and hazard the permanent estrangement of the one person whose presence kept the emptiness at bay since Earl's departure. A quandary that would leave any mother in my shoes torn between fierce love and the fear of becoming the villain in the story she desperately wanted to rewrite for a happier ending. Craving solitude to untangle the knots in my chest, I slipped away that evening to the familiar shores of Willow Lake, the expansive body of water just outside town where generations of Harlans had picnicked under sprawling oaks and cast lines for base that fought with the tenacity of life's own battles. its surface mirroring the bruised hues of sunset as I parked along the gravel access road and wandered the path to the weathered dock extending like an old friend's outstretched hand into the calm expanse. To my surprise, Lisa was already there, silhouetted against the fading light in casual jeans and a hooded sweatshirt that stripped away her usual polish. Pacing agitatedly with the retrieved suitcase at her feet like a reluctant companion in whatever internal war raged within her, oblivious to my approach as she held her phone to her ear murmuring fragments of desperation. I can't keep carrying this alone. It's suffocating everything good, her words dissolving into the lap of gentle waves. Before, in a surge of raw emotion that seemed directed at the accumulating pressures of scrutiny from me and perhaps shadows from her past, she gripped the case's handle and flung it into the shallow waters near the dock's end, the splash resounding with finality as it bobbed momentarily before beginning its slow submersion, trailed by silvery bubbles that distorted the reflection of the emerging stars overhead. Frozen in the tree-lean shadows, my pulse thundered in my ears like the roar of an approaching freight train, but mere seconds later a soft, desperate whimper emanated from the direction of the sinking luggage, faint yet unmistakable as a muffled cry of vulnerability that propelled me forward in a rush of adrenaline, shedding my sensible flats and wading into the cool, silty embrace up to my knees where the mud clung greedily to my skin as I grasped the sodden handle and dragged the heavy burden back to the wooden planks, water cascading in rivulets that soaked my hem while Lisa's car taillights vanished down the road in hasty retreat, abandoning the scene to whatever fate she'd impulsively decreed. With trembling hands slick from the lake's chill, I knelt on the dock and tugged at the zipper strained by the impact, the metallic teeth parting to reveal glimpses of soft fabrics bundled tightly alongside what appeared to be diminutive clothing items folded with care and a small, plush toy peeking from a side compartment, hints of a concealed life that sent chills racing along my spine far colder than the evening breeze. Was this evidence of a hidden pregnancy she sought to erase in a moment of panic? Or artifacts from an abandonment tied to the ghosts invoked by that Chicago correspondence that now threatened to engulf our family in waves of unforeseen consequences? Slamming the lid shut against the encroaching dusk, I staggered upright, clutching the dripping case like a lifeline tossed into turbulent seas, my mind reeling from the implications that blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator in Lisa's story. Just as Tom's truck headlights pierced the gloom from the access road, his hurried footsteps approaching with shouts of my name that blended concern and confusion, demanding to know what madness had unfolded by the water's edge where secrets nearly drowned before surfacing to demand reckoning. In that charged instant, as he reached for the suitcase with questions firing like sparks from a live wire, I slipped Lisa's discarded car keys from the dock's weathered boards where they'd fallen unnoticed during her flight, pocketing them with a wry inward smirk at the poetic symmetry of stranding her in the gathering dark as retribution for the chaos she'd unleashed upon us all. A witty payback that ensured she'd stew in her own isolation while we confronted the enigma she'd tried to submerge, though the faint echo of that whimper lingered in my ears like a siren's call, teasing the threshold of a truth that could either redeem or ruin the bonds we'd strained to their limits. That charged confrontation by the lake under the probing beams of Tom's truck headlights unfolded into an interminable vigil on the damp grass, where the suitcase lay between us like a reluctant oracle guarding truths we'd all been circling without the courage to unearth. Its sodden exterior beating with condensation from the cooling night air that carried the faint, earthy scent of wet soil and distant wood smoke from neighborhood chimneys preparing for the encroaching winter, as Tom, his face etched with a mixture of bewilderment and simmering frustration from the day's accumulating revelations, knelt to unfasten the stubborn zipper with hands steadier than my own trembling ones that had hauled it from the depths, his voice cutting through the tension with demands for explanations about why I'd been lurking like a sentinel in the shadows and what madness had driven Lisa to such a desperate discard that echoed the impulsive fractures in their marriage I'd unwittingly exacerbated through my persistent probes into her guarded world. As the contents tumbled forth in a disorganized cascade onto the makeshift blanket of his jacket spread across the ground, Yellowed envelopes bound with frayed twine that whispered of long-buried correspondences. A curled ultrasound image dated several months prior, revealing the tiny silhouette of what could only be their unborn child nestled in secrecy. And at the core a compact diary, whose water-warped pages chronicled Lisa's harrowing escape from an abusive ex in Chicago whose controlling grip had left scars deeper than the financial debts she'd shouldered to sever ties through lawyers and fresh starts that mirrored the very resilience I'd overlooked in my rush to label her the interloper. The soft, desperate sound that had lured me into the water resolved itself as the faint tinkling of a cracked wind-up music box lodged in a side pouch, its melody a haunting lullaby warped by the submersion yet evocative of maternal hopes she'd nearly silenced in a moment of overwhelming panic triggered by the mounting pressures of my suspicions converging with the resurfacing threats from her past. No gruesome horror greeted us, but a poignant mosaic of vulnerability that reframed Lisa not as the scheming outsider I'd vilified in my mind, but as a survivor whose secretive behavior stemmed from a history of betrayal far graver than any fleeting affair or fiscal folly. The letters from her own mother pleading in faded ink for her to break the cycle of toxic entanglements and flee the man who wielded control like a shadow over her ambitions, transforming the motel receipts into records of clandestine therapy sessions she'd hidden from shame, and the extravagant purchases into desperate bids for normalcy in a life appended by fear. While the debts accrued as legal bulwarks against a stalker who now loomed via that anonymous missive threatening to dismantle the fragile sanctuary she'd forged with Tom, a revelation that gutted me with the realization that my meddling revenges, those petty swaps and spills born of protective fury, had amplified her isolation to the point of endangering the very family expansion Tom dreamed of amid our strained dynamics. Tom's voice cracked as he pored over the diary's entries aloud, the words painting vivid scenes of bruises concealed under professional attire and nights spent plotting escapes that paralleled the quiet desperations I'd endured after Earl's death when loneliness sharpened every doubt into a blade, forcing me to confront the moral quagmire of my choices that had positioned me as the antagonist pushing a wounded woman toward the brink rather than extending the hand of understanding that might have bridged our divides earlier, a dilemma that swelled with the weight of potential loss, not just Tom's trust, but the grandchild whose existence now hung in the balance of stresses I'd unwittingly fueled, leaving me to wonder if audiences peering into this unraveling tapestry would condemn my oversteps as the hubris of a meddlesome matriarch or empathize with the fierce love that blinded me to subtler paths of support in a world where in-law tensions simmered like unspoken recipes at holiday tables across the heartland. Dawn broke with a fragile truce as we loaded the retrieved artifacts into the truck and drove in heavy silence to their home where Lisa waited, her silhouette visible through the kitchen window like a sentinel of her own weary vigil. And upon confronting her with the salvaged pieces spread across the breakfast nook amid cooling coffee mugs and half-eaten toast remnants from a sleepless night, she dissolved into confessions that wove the threads together, the pregnancy a joyful secret soured by the ex's reemergence via the letter that dredged up terrors she'd buried under career climbs and composed facades, her impulsive toss into the lake a cathartic bid to drown the past before it contaminated their future, though my intrusions had eroded her confidence to confide openly in the family circle she'd yearned to claim fully despite our cultural clashes. Tom's embrace of her amid the tears forged a tentative reconciliation that sidelined me momentarily as the architect of discord, yet, in a final gesture laced with the wry satisfaction of closure without outright cruelty, I retrieved from my purse the antique locket inherited from my mother, its silver surface etched with time's gentle patina, and enclosing a faded photograph of Earl in his prime, pressing it into Lisa's palm with a measured gaze and the words that carried both olive branch and subtle sting. This has guarded secrets through storms and held a family together longer than most. Maybe it'll whisper that not all buried things stay silent, but some deserve to surface for healing rather than harm. A witty inheritance that exposed the undercurrents of our shared vulnerabilities without demanding further excavation, allowing her a tangible emblem of tentative acceptance, while underscoring the irony of her discarded burdens now reclaimed through the very meddling she'd decried. As she and Tom departed later that morning for an appointment with a counselor recommended by Ruth, who specialized in relational rebuilds amid life's unexpected detours, I remained alone in the quiet house with the music box's melody replaying in loops from my memory, like an insistent refrain, its notes haunting not with malice, but with the profound ambiguity of what I'd wrought. Was my interference the catalyst for Truth's emergence that fortified their bond against external threats, or the fracture that scarred it indelibly with distrust and what-ifs that echoed the unresolved pains of my own widowhood? The lake's distant murmur lingers in my reflections, a reminder that some family secrets dissolve into ambiguity rather than resolution, prompting endless musings on redemption's elusive cost and whether the revenges we exact in love's name ultimately free us or chain us tighter to the echoes of our choices, leaving the heartland winds to carry those unanswered whispers into the vast, uncertain horizon.